The company party music faded. My father leaned in, his voice a tremor. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered. "Your stepmother hit me again." I stood paralyzed under the fluorescent glare of Candle Row, where she, Celeste Marrow, reigned as CFO. That night, I didn't call the cops. I opened my laptop, logged into the internal audit system, and started the countdown. Because if the office is a battlefield, a spreadsheet is a dagger. My name is Rowan Vale. I'm 32 years old, and my world is built on the elegant, immutable certainty of numbers. As the head of the data auditing team at Candle Row Insights, I live in a fortress of logic here in Blackwater, a city that prizes polish over principle. My job is to find the story hidden in the data, to trace the ghost signals in the machine until they resolve into a pattern, a truth. I don't deal in emotions. I deal in deviations, in anomalies that betray a system's flaws. I find the single misplaced decimal point that unravels a multi-million-dollar lie. My life is clean, ordered, and precise, or it was, until my father's world started bleeding into mine. The quarterly celebration on the 28th floor was the apex of Candle Row's corporate theater. The air, chilled to a perfect 68 degrees, smelled of expensive perfume and chilled Sauvignon Blanc. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling, indifferent lights of Blackwater below, a galaxy of ambition and asphalt. The clinking of crystal flutes provided a delicate, percussive rhythm to the low hum of conversation, the carefully modulated laughter, the hushed negotiations disguised as pleasantries. Every smile was an investment, every handshake a transaction. It was a room full of sharks dressed in bespoke suits and designer dresses, their teeth hidden behind veneers of civility. I stood near a pillar of polished steel, nursing a glass of sparkling water, observing the flow of power as I would a data stream, mapping the connections, noting the hierarchies. I was in my element, yet completely detached, an auditor in a sea of assets. Then the elevator doors slid open with a soft, deferential chime, and my carefully maintained detachment fractured. My father, Grant Vale, stepped onto the plush gray carpet, looking as out of place as a work boot in a jewelry box. He was an electrical contractor, a man whose hands were more familiar with copper wire and conduit than the stem of a champagne flute. His tie, a gift from me 2 Christmases ago, was knotted slightly askew, a small rebellion against the corporate uniform, but it wasn't the tie that seized my attention. It was the faint, yellowish-purple discoloration blooming just below his right eye, a ghostly crescent that a clumsy, hasty application of concealer had failed to fully mask. He moved through the crowd with an apology in his posture, his shoulders hunched, his eyes scanning the room not for a friendly face, but for a threat. He found me, and the relief that washed over his features was so profound it was almost painful to watch. He navigated the clusters of laughing executives and reached me, his hand finding my arm with a grip that was just a little too tight. "Rowan," he breathed, the scent of stale coffee and fear on his breath. He pulled me behind the steel pillar, into a pocket of relative privacy. The party's cheerful noise became a muffled roar. He leaned in close, his mouth near my ear, and the words came out, broken and fragile. "Don't tell anyone, sweetheart. Celeste." She did it again. The sentence was a shard of glass, unfinished but razor sharp. He didn't need to complete it. The name hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. He pulled back, trying to force a smile that was a grotesque parody of happiness, his gaze darting across the room. He swallowed hard, the sound clicking in the sudden silence of our alcove. The story he wouldn't finish was written on his face, in the slight tremor of his hand, in the way he flinched when someone laughed too loudly behind him. My eyes followed his nervous glance and found her. Celeste Marrow, my stepmother, the chief financial officer of Candle Row Insights. She stood at the center of the room's most powerful circle, a queen holding court. She was laughing, her head tilted back just so, a perfectly manicured hand resting on the arm of our CEO. Marcus Thorne, Beside them, the firm's general counsel, a man whose face was a permanent mask of shrewd calculation, nodded along to whatever brilliant point she was making. Her smile was a masterpiece of corporate engineering, bright and dazzling, and utterly without warmth. It was a smile that could approve a billion-dollar merger or sign off on a mass layoff with the exact same unnerving placidity. It was sharp, thin, and metallic, like the edge of a paperclip. She was immaculate in a tailored gray dress that probably cost more than my father's monthly income, a single, elegant pearl pin at her collar. To the world, to this room, she was a titan, brilliant, decisive, untouchable. To me, she was the anomaly I could never reconcile, the error in the system of my life. My gaze dropped from her triumphant face back to my father. My fingers, acting of their own accord, reached out and gently brushed the sleeve of his jacket back from his wrist. There it was, a constellation of bruises, darker and angrier than the one on his face, circling his wrist like a grim bracelet. They were the shape of fingers, a grip. My blood didn't boil. It didn't rush. It turned cold, slow, and heavy in my veins, solidifying into something like tempered steel. The ambient warmth of the party evaporated. The sound of clinking glasses faded into a distant, tinny echo. In that moment, the entire 28th floor, with its panoramic views and its expensive champagne, became a sterile crime scene, and I was the forensic analyst. As if sensing my stare through the crush of bodies, Celeste's gaze flickered across the room and locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, her smile tightened, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the cold assessment beneath. Her eyes darted down to my hand on my father's wrist, then back to my face, a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in a silent question, a challenge. Then, the mask was back, brighter than before. She disengaged from the CEO with a fluid grace and called out, her voice carrying across the room, smooth and commanding. "Grant, darling, Rowan, come, you're missing the fun. We must get a family picture." She beckoned us over toward the massive backlit Candle Row logo, a beacon of corporate integrity. "A picture of the model family," she added, turning to the CEO with a wink. The irony was so thick it was nauseating. My father stiffened, a puppet whose strings had been violently yanked. He tried to pull his arm away, but I held firm, my touch now a silent promise. I guided him forward, moving through the crowd that parted for us as if we were approaching royalty. I manufactured a smile, stretching my lips into a shape that felt alien to my face. It was a smile I had practiced in mirrors, the one reserved for board meetings and performance reviews, a mask of my own. As the company photographer raised his camera, I positioned myself between my father and Celeste, a human buffer zone. The flash went off, a blinding white explosion that momentarily bleached the world. But behind my frozen smile, my mind was already racing, gears clicking into place with cold, logical precision. A checklist scrolled through my consciousness, a series of access protocols and database queries. Expense reports, T&E logs, corporate card statements, access card key logs for all 28 floors and the executive garage, vehicle fleet GPS records, security camera footage from every conceivable angle, especially the parking structure and the elevators. The architecture of the company's digital soul laid itself bare in my mind. Every transaction, every entry, every movement was recorded somewhere. Data doesn't lie. It just waits for the right person to ask the right questions. My father, sensing the shift in my demeanor, the dangerous stillness that had settled over me, began to tremble. As we stepped away from the logo and the applause for our perfect family portrait died down, he leaned in again, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper against my ear. "Rowan, please, just let it go. Don't make a scene." His plea was that of a long-term prisoner, begging a visitor not to antagonize the guards. He was terrified not of her violence, but of the fallout, the escalation he knew would come. He saw a scene, a shouting match, a public humiliation. He saw a messy, emotional confrontation he couldn't survive. I looked at him, at the good, kind man who had taught me how to read and how to ride a bike, now so thoroughly beaten down that he was pleading for the right to remain a victim in silence. I placed a hand on his shoulder, my smile still fixed in place for the benefit of any watching eyes. I gave a single, slow nod. "I won't," I promised him, and I meant it. I wouldn't make a scene. A scene was messy, unpredictable, emotional. I was an auditor. I dealt in facts, in evidence, in irrefutable proof compiled into a quiet, damning report. I wouldn't make a scene. I would build a case the perfect size and shape for a closed-door, emergency session of the board of directors. Celeste had entered our lives like a corporate takeover, swift, decisive, and immaculately documented. She and my father had a whirlwind 6-month courtship that culminated in a quiet city hall ceremony. She didn't move into our modest suburban house. She annexed it. She arrived with 2 sleek suitcases, the faint, cloying scent of burnt cinnamon perfume that clung to every room, and a prenuptial agreement as thick as a software manual. My father, blinded by what he called her spark, saw a partner. I saw a meticulously executed acquisition. From day one, she began optimizing our lives, streamlining our routines, and cutting emotional overhead with the same ruthless efficiency she applied to a corporate budget. At Candle Row, Celeste was a legend, a force of nature. They called her the midwife of deals, because she could nurse the most difficult, protracted negotiations to a successful birth. Her signature, a sharp, elegant C. Marrow, was always the last on any major contract, the final seal of approval that sent millions, sometimes billions, of dollars into motion. She was never late. She never missed a decimal point. Her projections were uncannily accurate, her risk assessments flawless. She was the bedrock of the company's financial stability, a paragon of control and competence. People admired her, feared her, but no one ever questioned her authority. Her perfection was her armor, and it was impenetrable. But the armor came off at the front door of our house. The meticulous control she applied to balance sheets was turned inward, becoming a domestic tyranny measured in locked cabinets and confiscated credit cards. The first thing she did was install a new keyed lock on the liquor cabinet, where my father kept a single bottle of aged whiskey for special occasions. Then she took over the household finances, demanding every receipt, scrutinizing every purchase. His weekly allowance was less than an intern's lunch money. She wasn't managing a budget, she was auditing his soul, and she found him wanting in every line item. He, a man who ran his own small but successful contracting business, was forced to ask for money to buy a new pair of work boots. Her control was absolute, a slow, methodical strangulation of his independence. I saw the cracks long before the bruises became undeniable. About a year ago, while running a routine quarterly audit, I stumbled upon a recurring anomaly, a series of unusually high consulting fees paid to a vendor I'd never heard of, all approved by Celeste's office. The paper trail was pristine, but the justification was vague. It felt wrong, like a perfectly balanced equation that nonetheless described an impossible reality. I filed an anonymous report through the company's official whistleblower portal, detailing the irregularities and the vendor's phantom digital footprint. The response from the legal department came back a week later. A single, sterile sentence that felt like a slammed door. Further investigation has determined there is insufficient evidence to proceed. I knew then that her armor extended beyond her own actions. It was reinforced by a corporate structure that had no incentive to look too closely at its most valuable asset. She wasn't just protected, she was insulated. The insulation extended to our quiet, tree-lined street. On Saturdays, the sound of a perfectly manicured lawn being mowed was sometimes punctuated by a different, sharper noise from behind their closed doors, a muffled shout, the distinct, percussive crash of something heavy hitting a wall. It was always followed by a profound, ringing silence, a vacuum of sound that was more terrifying than the noise itself. It felt like a hastily recalled email, a moment of violence erased from the public record. When a concerned neighbor once asked my father if everything was all right after seeing a vase in their curbside trash, shattered into 100 pieces, he had deployed his standard, practiced response, a hollow laugh, a wave of the hand. "Just a marital spat," he'd say, his eyes not quite meeting theirs. "You know how it is," and they would nod, relieved to be absolved of the responsibility of knowing more. Celeste's methods of control were often disguised as acts of generosity, poisoned gifts wrapped in expensive paper. For my 30th birthday, she gave me a top-of-the-line smartwatch. "To help you keep track of your health. Rowan," she'd said, her smile as bright and sterile as an operating theater. "You work such long hours." I knew it wasn't about my heart rate. The watch came with a shared family fitness app that she insisted we all use. It was a digital leash. It tracked my location, my sleep patterns, my late nights at the office. It was her way of knowing, always knowing, where I was, when I might be coming home, when I might be talking to my father. It was a surveillance device presented as a wellness tool. Over the past 3 years, I had become an unwilling expert in her particular brand of camouflage. I learned to read the story behind the pristine facade. The Marrow Foundation, her signature charitable project dedicated to empowering women in business, was a PR masterpiece, generating glowing press while its financial statements remained conveniently opaque. The frequent, expensive client dinners at Blackwater's finest restaurants, charged to her corporate account, often coincided with nights my father called me, his voice low and strained. The last-minute branch inspections that required cross-country flights and luxury hotel stays were her getaways, her rewards to herself, funded by the company she served so devotedly. She had built an entire alternate reality, a perfect corporate legend, and used it to hide the ugly, brutal truth of her private life. She was a master of creative accounting, both in the office and at home. But tonight was different. Tonight, the abstract data points of my suspicion had a physical manifestation. The bruise on my father's face was not an anomaly that could be explained away by a statistical norm. It was hard proof, a data point written in flesh and blood. It was the final, undeniable piece of evidence that demanded action. His whispered plea, "Don't tell anyone," was the desperate prayer of a man who had forgotten he had a right to be safe. But his bruise was a direct order to me. It bypassed protocol. It superseded his fear. It was a command prompt, waiting for me to execute. I left the party without saying goodbye. The ghost of my father's trembling hand still on my arm. The drive home was a blur of streetlights. My mind a cold, silent server room processing the night's events. I walked into my quiet apartment, the corporate smile finally melting from my face. Leaving behind a grim, determined mask. There would be no more anonymous reports, no more watching from the sidelines. The time for observation was over. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the dual monitors painting my face in a cool blue light. I bypassed my personal files, my emails, my own life. I opened a secure connection to the Candle Row servers, my fingers flying across the keyboard, typing in the long, complex passwords from memory. I navigated through layers of security, my credentials granting me access to the company's deepest digital vaults. I opened the file I had built in secret over the last year, a private project born of suspicion and fear. CER Delta Exceptions X. It was a workbook of discrepancies, a collection of every statistical outlier and unexplained variance I had ever flagged. It was my secret ledger of Candle Row's sins. Each tab was a different department, a different project, a different executive. My eyes went to the very last tab, the one I had created only 6 months ago, the one I had hoped I would never have to use. The label was simple, stark, and contained a world of meaning. It read, Marrow. I clicked on it, the screen filled with rows and columns of raw data, a chaotic sea of numbers, but to me, it was a map, and I knew exactly where the treasure was buried. My apartment is my laboratory, a sanctuary of controlled variables and quiet analysis. The city outside could burn. But within these walls, the only thing that mattered was the signal in the noise. The target of my analysis was the financial data stream of Celeste's department, a river of transactions I knew intimately. For 18 months, I had watched a ghost in her machine, a subtle, persistent anomaly that no one else had ever seen, or perhaps ever wanted to see. It was a variance in the travel and entertainment expense reports, a deviation that always, without fail, resolved to 1.73%, not 1.7%, not 1.75%, always 1.73%, in the chaotic world of corporate spending. Such consistency is not just unlikely, it's a statistical impossibility. Randomness is messy, perfection, in data, is a confession. It was a rounding error so exquisitely precise it could only be deliberate. It was the digital signature of a crime. I began by isolating every expense report that contributed to this recurring anomaly. The pattern that emerged was as clear as a circuit diagram. The 1.73% deviations were consistently linked to a series of invoices for off-site strategy meetings. These meetings were always scheduled for late evenings, often on Fridays, and they were always catered and facilitated by a single, recurring vendor, Ash Bristle Partners. The name was blandly corporate, designed to be forgotten, to slide through an accounts payable system without a second glance. The payments were substantial, but individually calibrated to fly just under the threshold that would trigger a mandatory secondary review. It was meticulously planned, expertly executed, and it had been happening right under their noses for a year and a half. Celeste wasn't just stealing, she was skimming, siphoning a steady, calculated stream from the corporate lifeblood. The first step was to validate the vendor. A simple query in the federal database confirmed that Ash Bristle Partners possessed a legitimate employer identification number. The company was registered as a limited liability partnership in Delaware, the go-to state for corporate anonymity. On the surface, it was a real entity. This was the first layer of her defense, the plausible deniability that had satisfied the legal department's cursory glance. But I wasn't legal. I was an auditor. I dug deeper. The company's registered address was a post office box in a strip mall. It had no website, no phone number, no digital footprint beyond the invoices it submitted to Candle Row. I ran a search for its listed partners, Jessica Stone and Martin Slate. The names were as generic as the company's. The real breakthrough came when I pulled the corporate registration filings, which included a low-resolution headshot for the primary partner, Ms. Stone. The image was grainy, but the face seemed vaguely familiar. I ran it through a reverse image search engine. Within seconds, I had a match. It was a stock photograph from a generic business-themed collection, titled Confident Female Executive. To add a thin veneer of originality, the image had been mirror-flipped. The mole on her left cheek was now on her right. It was a lazy, almost arrogant piece of deception, a testament to Celeste's belief that no one would ever bother to look this closely. With the vendor confirmed as a phantom, the next step was to link it directly to Celeste. The invoices themselves were sterile, bearing no signature other than a generic corporate stamp. But the digital submission process was another matter. I compiled the metadata from every invoice submitted by Ash Bristle Partners and fed the string into a proprietary fraud detection model I had designed. The model wasn't looking for doctored numbers. It was looking for patterns in the code, for the digital tics and habits of the creator. It analyzed everything from the software used to create the PDF invoices to the naming conventions of the files. After several minutes of processing, the model returned its findings. A single, recurring three-letter pattern was embedded in the file properties of 97% of the invoices, a digital watermark, almost certainly unintentional. The letters were CBM, Celeste Blythe Marrow. Her own initials, a ghost of her ego haunting every fraudulent document. It was the digital equivalent of leaving a fingerprint on the knife. The digital evidence was damning, but I needed to tie it to her physical actions. I needed to shatter the alibi of the off-site meetings. I wrote a script to cross-reference two separate data streams. the timestamp on Celeste's digital approval of each ash bristle payment, and the security logs from the Candle Row executive parking garage. The result was a perfect, damning timeline. At the exact moments she was supposedly attending these catered meetings across town, the security camera footage showed her swiping her access card at the garage exit. Her sleek black sedan could be seen pulling out onto the street, heading not toward a conference center, but in the direction of her penthouse apartment. She was approving the payments for phantom meetings from the comfort of her own home, while the system recorded her presence at an event that never took place. The lie was absolute, documented in timestamps and high-resolution video. The final layer of her deception was the most painful, the most viciously elegant. As I dug into the payment method for the Uber corporate account linked to these fictitious meetings, I expected to find a ghost credit card or a complex shell account. The truth was far simpler and far crueler. The rides, which were supposedly for transporting executives to and from these strategy sessions, were all charged to a supplementary corporate card. I pulled the account details. My breath caught in my chest. The cardholder's name was listed as Grant V. My father. She was using a card issued in his name, a benefit he received as the spouse of a senior executive, to pay for the transportation that facilitated her fraud. She was wrapping her crime in his identity, making him an unwitting accessory. If anyone ever looked, it would appear he was the one authorizing these expenses. It was a brilliant, cruel masterstroke, a way to embezzle from her company while simultaneously implicating the man she abused at home. I stared at my father's name on the screen, a pawn in her sick, meticulous game. The cold precision in my veins burned for a moment, turning into something white-hot. I took a step back from the monitor, the full architecture of her scheme now laid bare before me. It was a work of art, in its own sociopathic way, vicious, intricate, and built to withstand a superficial audit. She had used her intimate knowledge of the system to exploit its every weakness, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of fraud. But she made one critical error. She assumed no one would ever have a reason to look deeper. She couldn't account for a variable like me. The bruise on my father's face had given me that reason. Now, I had the past. I had 18 months of irrefutable, documented history of her crimes. But a historical report could be dismissed, buried in litigation, explained away by high-priced lawyers as a complex misunderstanding. I needed to catch her in the present. I needed to create a trap and watch her step into it willingly. I needed a digital confession. I began to construct my honeypot. It took the form of a single, perfectly crafted contract proposal. It was from a new, pre-vetted IT vendor for emergency server maintenance and diagnostics, a plausible and urgent-sounding request. The amount was for $12,000. It was a carefully chosen number, high enough to require direct CFO approval, but low enough not to seem extraordinary. I backdated the initial request by a week to make it look like it had been working its way through the proper channels. I attached a fabricated email chain, complete with technical jargon from the IT department head, whose signature I could easily replicate. The proposal was a ghost, a perfect illusion of corporate procedure. The core of the trap, however, was in the approval system itself. I embedded a script in the final approval link that would be sent to Celeste. It was a digital tripwire. The moment she clicked Approve, the system wouldn't just log the action, it would capture a complete snapshot of the event, her unique user credentials, the IP address of the device she used, the machine's MAC address, and a precise, nanosecond accurate timestamp. If she approved this contract, it would create an unbreakable, cryptographically secure chain of evidence linking her, and only her, to the authorization of a payment to a company that did not exist. It would be her digital fingerprint on the trigger of the gun. All that was left was to choose the moment. I looked at the clock on my screen. 10:48 p.m. She would be home from the party by now, flushed with the success of the evening, confident in her untouchable power. She would be checking her emails one last time before bed, a creature of habit and control. I scheduled the automated approval request to be sent to her inbox at exactly 23:17. 11:17 p.m. An odd, specific time. A time that suggested an automated system at work, not a human operator setting a trap. A time when she would believe the rest of the world, especially the daughter who had smiled so placidly at her all evening, was sound asleep. The bait was in the water. The digital jaws of the trap were set. All I had to do now was wait for the shark to bite. The wait was a specific kind of torture, a low-frequency hum of anticipation beneath the floorboards of my consciousness. I didn't pace. I didn't check the clock. I sat in the blue glow of my monitor, my screen displaying a live log of the approval server. My heartbeat was a steady, metronomic 60 beats per minute. The system was my chessboard, and I had just moved my queen into position. I was an auditor, and waiting was part of the process. You set the conditions, you run the test, and you wait for the inevitable result. At 23:19:02, the log flickered. A new line of text appeared, stark and black against the white screen. Request ID 8812G. Status approved. Approver ID C. Marrow. IP address 72.21.215.14. A quick trace confirmed the IP address was registered to the Blackwater Luxury Residence's penthouse suite. My trap had snapped shut. A cold, clean satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't triumph. It was verification. The hypothesis had been proven correct. The data point was captured. I hadn't even had time to archive the log before a second notification chimed. This one from my corporate email client. The sender's name lit up the corner of my screen. Celeste Marrow, my blood, which had been so calm and cool, felt like it had been flash-frozen. The subject line was 2 words. Urgent meeting. The body was just 1 sentence. Rowan, be in my conference room at 8 a.m. sharp. The message was time-stamped 23:19:34. 32 seconds. It took her 32 seconds from approving a fraudulent contract to summoning me for an execution. I hadn't just caught her. I had triggered an immediate, aggressive counter-protocol. The predator knew it had stepped on a wire. The smell of burning rubber filled my apartment. The walk from the elevator to her conference room the next morning was the longest in my life. The office was just coming alive, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the low murmur of morning greetings. People smiled at me, said my name, completely oblivious to the fact that I was a dead woman walking. I felt like a ghost, already erased from the corporate photograph. Celeste's conference room was on the corner of the 28th floor, a cube of glass and steel that overlooked the entire city. It was designed to convey transparency and power, a place where deals were made in the full light of day, but it was also a fishbowl, a place where you could be watched, judged, and dissected from all sides. She was already there, seated at the head of the long obsidian table. She looked flawless, dressed in a severe navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a chignon so tight it seemed to pull the skin taut around her eyes, making them look even colder and more calculating. Opposite her sat Arthur Vance, the company's general counsel. Vance was a man in his 50s with a perfectly tailored suit and a face that had been scrubbed of all emotion. He was the company incarnate, pragmatic, ruthless, and loyal only to the bottom line. His pen was on the table, perfectly parallel to a notepad. He didn't look at me as I entered. He was a spectator, a referee, and a potential executioner all in one. "Rowan, close the door. Sit," Celeste commanded, her voice calm and even. The soundproof door clicked shut, sealing us in. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy. On the table in front of her was a binder, at least 3 inches thick, its white cover stark against the black table. She let me stare at it for a long moment, letting its weight sink in. "We have a problem," she began, her eyes locked on mine. "A serious one." She tapped the binder with a single, perfectly manicured finger. "This is a formal complaint, filed through the anonymous ethics portal, a complaint of workplace harassment, intimidation, and the creation of a hostile environment." She paused, letting the words hang in the sterile air. "The complaint was filed against me. and the digital forensics team traced the submission back to a personal device, a tablet, that was logged into your home network. It was a masterstroke, a preemptive, decapitating strike. She hadn't just denied my unmade accusation, she had created one of her own, casting me as a vindictive, unstable employee with a personal vendetta. She was framing my investigation as a campaign of harassment. She was turning my evidence into the motive for my crime. The audacity of it was breathtaking. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a fight-or-flight response that I had to brutally suppress. My face, my body, had to be a blank slate. I summoned every ounce of control I possessed and arranged my features into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. I widened my eyes slightly, let my mouth fall open. What? I don't understand. I would never… That's insane. My voice was a carefully calibrated mixture of shock and fear. Celeste watched me, her expression unreadable. I'm glad to hear you say that, Rowan, because this is, of course, a very damaging allegation for everyone, she gestured to Vance, who still hadn't moved a muscle. The company takes these matters with the utmost seriousness. An investigation is already underway. Of course, I stammered, playing my part. I'll cooperate fully. I'll give them anything they need, my devices, my passwords, whatever it takes to clear my name. I didn't do this. I believe you, Celeste said, and the lie was so smooth, so polished, it was almost beautiful. I believe this is a misunderstanding. However, the complaint is real, and it brings to light a delicate situation. She slid a single folder out from beneath the massive binder. It was thin, blue, and had my name on it. She pushed it across the table toward me. Given our familial connection, Arthur and I agree that we need to formalize our professional boundaries to prevent any further misunderstandings. I opened the folder. Inside was a single document, 2 pages long, dense with legal text. It was a non-disclosure agreement, a gag order. I scanned the paragraphs, the cold, precise language of the law. It was a standard NDA, with one custom-tailored addition, Clause 4B. It explicitly prohibited the discussion of any and all matters related to personal or familial relationships, dynamics, or events within the context of the workplace, or with any employee of Candle Row Insights. It was a legal wall, designed to quarantine her home life from her corporate one. If I signed it, any mention of my father, his bruises, or her abuse would be a direct breach of contract, grounds for immediate termination and a lawsuit. She was trying to legally forbid me from telling the truth. This is just a formality, Celeste said, her voice softening, a predator soothing its prey. To protect you, to protect me, and to protect the company. It simply states that we agree to keep our family life separate from our work life. Once this is signed, I'm confident the baseless harassment complaint will be resolved and we can all move on. Vance finally spoke, his voice dry as dust. It's in your best interest to sign it, Ms. Vale. It demonstrates cooperation and a desire to de-escalate the situation. His pen began to tap, a slow, deliberate rhythm against the table. Tap, tap, tap. It was a countdown. My mind was a whirlwind. This was the moment. The entire game hinged on this single action. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my own pen. It was a simple, elegant fountain pen, black with a silver clip, a gift from my father. I had modified it myself. A high-resolution pinhole camera was embedded just above the clip, its lens no bigger than a speck of dust. Its microphone was military-grade. I unscrewed the cap, the movement slow and deliberate. Okay, I said, my voice quiet, submissive. If you think this is for the best. I clicked the top of the pen. It was a silent, spring-loaded mechanism. A tiny, nearly invisible blue light on the clip blinked once, then went dark. It was now recording. I pulled the document toward me and flattened it on the table. I angled my hand as I signed, ensuring the camera had a clear, unobstructed view of the text, of Celeste and Vance watching me, of my signature forming on the page. Rowan Vale. The ink was black and final. I put the cap back on the pen and pushed the signed document back to the center of the table. Celeste's smile was thin, victorious. Vance's pen stopped tapping. They thought they had won. They thought the threat was neutralized. I let the silence sit for a beat. Then, I looked directly at Celeste, my expression still one of carefully crafted innocence. The blue light on my pen had blinked. The evidence was secure. The room was no longer her fortress. It was my witness stand. "Celeste," I asked, my voice level and clear, "just so I understand the boundaries, for the future, as a financial officer of this company, have you ever used the supplementary corporate card issued in my father's name, Grant Vale, to authorize company payments?" The air in the room changed. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Vance's eyes, which had been so disinterested, snapped into sharp focus, darting from me to Celeste. He wasn't a spectator anymore. Celeste's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, passed through her eyes. It was the first crack in her perfect armor. She leaned back in her chair and gave a small, condescending laugh. The sound was like ice cracking. "Rowan, darling," she said, her voice dripping with pity, "don't be ridiculous. Your paranoia is exactly what this document is designed to prevent. You don't have a single shred of proof of anything." I held her gaze. I didn't say a word. I just let her statement hang in the air. Recorded, documented, and sealed. "You're wrong." I thought, the words a silent vow in the back of my mind. "I have the spreadsheet. I have the server logs. I have the video. And you, Celeste, you just signed the confession." The smartwatch Celeste gave me was a beautiful piece of technology. A sleek black mirror on a silver chain-link band. On its surface, it displayed the time, my notifications, my heart rate. It was meant to be her eye, a window into my life, but a mirror works both ways. The day I received it, I spent 12 hours in my apartment, not wearing it, but dismantling its software. I reverse-engineered the firmware, peeling back the layers of the proprietary operating system until I reached its core. I didn't disable her access. I expanded it. I wrote a new, parasitic utility, a piece of ghost code that lived in the watch's memory. It did everything the original software did, but it also did one thing more. It created a secondary, encrypted data stream that logged not just biometrics, but ambient noise levels, accelerometer data, and GPS coordinates, broadcasting it all to a private server I controlled. She had given me a surveillance device, and I had turned it into an evidence locker. The true genius of the plan, however, belonged to my father. It was his first, quiet act of rebellion. I presented him with the modified watch and a simple set of instructions. He was terrified, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it, but the fear was warring with a tiny, flickering ember of defiance. Every night, after Celeste was asleep, he would take the watch from my wrist, where I wore it during the day to maintain the illusion, and place it on her side of the vanity in their master bedroom. It was a perfect, silent witness. It sat there all night, all morning, absorbing the truth of their home. Its polished black face reflected the curated perfection of her bedroom, while its sensors recorded the chaos she created. I synchronized its data feed with the timestamp from the camera in their apartment building's hallway, the one aimed at their front door. The watch told me what was happening inside. The camera told me who was there when it happened. The data that flowed from that watch was a portrait of a private war. I created a dashboard that visualized the inputs in real time. Most of the time, the accelerometer was still, the microphone picking up only the low hum of the building's HVAC system. But then there were the spikes. The accelerometer would register a sudden, violent jolt, the watch vibrating on the marble countertop as something heavy was slammed down. The microphone would capture a sharp, percussive crack, followed by Celeste's voice, a low, controlled hiss of venom, and my father's muffled, pleading replies. And her heart rate, when she'd pick it up in the morning to put on, before the rage had cooled, would be elevated, a frantic, jagged line on my graph. The most damning correlation came when I overlaid this domestic data with her corporate activity. I isolated 3 specific instances from the past month. In each case, the watch's sensors recorded a major disturbance at home between 7 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. Shouting, a crash, the sound of a door slamming. Her heart rate, logged minutes later, was consistently above 120 beats per minute. Yet, the corporate ledger showed that at those exact times, she was logged into the system, digitally signing off on client entertainment expenses and approving invoices from Ash Bristle Partners. The story the data told was chillingly clear. She was starting her day with an act of domestic violence, then immediately sitting down to her laptop to commit corporate fraud. Her adrenaline-fueled rage channeled into the cold, precise keystrokes of a thief. This was the core of my case, the final piece of the puzzle that connected the two Celestes, the corporate titan and the domestic tyrant. They were not separate entities. One fueled the other. I wrote a final script, a simple piece of code that fused the disparate data streams into a single, undeniable narrative. It took the biometric and sensor data from the watch, the video log from the hallway camera, the keycard access logs from the Candle Row garage, and the financial approval records from the accounting server. It plotted them all on a single, interactive timeline. The result was no longer a collection of suspicious data points. It was a weapon. 3 distinct, verifiable data streams, home, office, and finance, twisting together like strands of a rope, forming a noose that pointed directly at Celeste's name. I exported the entire file, a comprehensive, multi-layered dossier of her crimes. It was a self-contained prosecution, complete with video clips, audio snippets, annotated financial records, and data visualizations that left no room for interpretation. I saved 1 copy to a military-grade encrypted drive, which I placed in a safe deposit box. The other copy had a more immediate destination. I logged into a secure, anonymous email client and attached the file. The recipient was Inez Wolf, the chairwoman of the board of directors at Candle Row. Wolf was a former federal prosecutor, a woman with a reputation for intellectual rigor and a complete lack of sentimentality. She was the one person on the board I knew Celeste couldn't charm, bully, or manipulate. I knew my message would be scrutinized, so I made it brief, urgent, and pointed. I couldn't risk it being dismissed as corporate infighting. I typed a single sentence below the attached file. Chairwoman Wolf, my apologies for the late hour. But I have reason to believe that if I wait until morning to send this, the source data may no longer exist. It was the perfect bait. It suggested not just wrongdoing, but an active, ongoing cover-up. It created an imperative for immediate action, forcing her to open the file before the evidence could be disappeared. I hit send. The message vanished into the encrypted ether, a digital time bomb delivered to the highest level of the company. My next move was for Celeste herself. I knew she had back-end access to the company's email servers. She likely had an alert set for any communication I sent to the board or senior leadership. She would know I had sent something to Wolf, and she would move to intercept it. I was counting on it. I logged into my own corporate email account and composed a new message to my direct supervisor. The subject was Project Lantern Analysis. Inside, I wrote a harmless paragraph about quarterly data consolidation, but I also attached a file, Lantern Financials Q3, protected, XLSX. The file was a decoy. It contained nothing but meaningless dummy data. Its true purpose was the tracker embedded in its code. The moment the file was opened, it would ping my private server, logging the user, the time, and the IP address of the person who accessed it. I was planting a bug, knowing she would be listening. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, the deep red liquid a stark contrast to the cool blue light of my monitors. I didn't need to wait long. At 1:47 a.m., I received an alert. The bait file had been opened. The user credentials logged were not Celeste's, but those of her executive assistant, a young, ambitious woman who was fiercely loyal. But the IP address wasn't from the assistant's home or office. It was the same one I had logged just hours before. 72.21215. Celeste's penthouse. She was using her assistant's credentials as a cutout. A pathetic attempt at plausible deniability. To spy on me. She was scared, and she was getting sloppy. I took a slow sip of wine. On one screen, I had the confirmation of my message delivered to Inez Wolf. On the other, I had the log proving Celeste was actively engaged in corporate espionage against me, on my main monitor. I pulled up the live feed from the smartwatch. It was resting on her vanity. A silent, black witness. The ambient noise was negligible. The accelerometer was flat. Her home was finally quiet. The storm had passed. I looked at the clock. In a few hours, the sun would rise over Blackwater. Inez Wolf would open her email. The board would be alerted, and the quiet, stable lines on my graphs would begin to explode. The summons came at dawn, a sterile calendar invitation with a single, ominous title, Extraordinary Session of the Board of Directors. It was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. in the main boardroom, the glass-walled Cathedral of Commerce on the 30th floor. When I arrived, the atmosphere was glacial. The sound-absorbing panels on the walls seemed to drink the very air from the room, creating a vacuum of unnatural silence. The members of the board were already assembled around the massive granite table, a jury of 7-figure suits, their faces impassive, their loyalties hidden behind masks of professional neutrality. At the head of the table, in the seat of power, sat Celeste. She was a vision of composed innocence, dressed in a dove-gray suit that seemed to absorb the light. A single, luminous pearl pin was fastened at her throat. Her eyes, when they met mine, were clear, calm, and utterly without blemish. She looked like a martyr, patiently waiting for justice to be served. I took the single, empty chair designated for me, a seat usually reserved for junior presenters, positioned at the far end of the table like a defendant in the dock. Arthur Vance, the general counsel, cleared his throat. The sound was like stone grinding on stone. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at the thick binder in front of him, and began. "This session has been called to address a serious internal matter," he intoned, his voice a flat, legal drone. "A formal complaint has been filed against a senior executive of this company. However, our preliminary investigation has revealed that the complaint itself may be a fabrication, part of a calculated campaign of harassment against that same executive." His eyes, cold and gray as the granite table, lifted and settled on me. The complaint in question was filed against CFO Celeste Marrow. The campaign of harassment, we have reason to believe, was orchestrated by an employee present in this room, Ms. Rowan Vale. The accusation hung in the dead air. I didn't look at Celeste. I didn't look at the impassive faces of the board members. I looked directly into the lens of the high-definition video conferencing camera at the center of the table. My gaze aimed squarely at the remote feed I knew was being watched by Chairwoman Inez Wolf. I let the weight of the charge settle, letting them believe they had me cornered, that the proceedings would follow their script. Then I raised my hand, a small, calm gesture. "Mr. Vance?" I said, my voice steady, cutting through his prepared remarks. "Before we proceed with a discussion about me, I asked the board to listen to something first. It's a recording. It's 38 seconds long." A flicker of annoyance crossed Vance's face, but before he could object, Inez Wolf's voice crackled through the speakers, crisp and authoritative. "Proceed, Ms. Vale." I took out my phone, my movements slow and deliberate. I tapped the screen, and the room was filled with the faint, ambient sound of the company party from 2 nights ago. The ghost of laughter, the distant clink of a glass, and then, underneath it all, a man's voice, my father's voice, so fragile it threatened to disintegrate into static. "Don't tell anyone," it whispered, a raw wound of a sound. "Your stepmother hit me again." The final word echoed and then vanished, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than before. It was a silence filled with the sudden, uncomfortable weight of truth. Every eye in the room was on Celeste. She didn't flinch. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, and she let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was a sound of pure condescension. "Really, Rowan?" she said, shaking her head as if disappointed in a child. "Audio is so easily manipulated these days. I'm surprised you'd resort to such a cheap, theatrical trick." "You're right," I said, meeting her gaze. "Audio can be manipulated, but data streams can't." I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's main display. The 50-foot screen behind Celeste flickered to life. "This," I said, as the first image appeared, "is a data visualization from the smartwatch you gave me for my birthday." The screen showed a split timeline. On the top, a graph depicting a jagged, panicked spike in biometric readings, accelerometer jolts, elevated ambient noise, recorded at 7:12 a.m. from your home. On the bottom, a screenshot of the Candle Row accounting system, showing your digital approval of an invoice from Ash Bristle Partners. Time-stamped 7:12 a.m. This is you, committing fraud, still flush with the adrenaline of your morning's activities. I clicked to the next slide. The screen split again. On the left, security footage from the executive garage, showing your sedan leaving the building. On the right, a system log showing your credentials being used to approve a series of T&E expenses for an off-site meeting you never attended. The timestamps were identical, down to the second. Here you are, simultaneously in your car and, according to your records, in a strategy session across town. I advanced to the final, simplest slide. It was a single line of text, stark white against a black background. Approval ID 8812G, 12,000 USD, 2319-02. IP address 7221-215-14. And this is you, last night, approving a payment for a fictitious IT contract from your penthouse, just 32 seconds before you emailed me the summons to this meeting. The room was utterly still. The board members were no longer looking at me. They were staring at the screen, then at Celeste, the pieces visibly clicking into place in their minds. Celeste's face was a mask of stone, but I could see a faint, telltale muscle twitching in her jaw. I reached into my pocket and took out my father's pen. I placed it gently on the granite table. The sound was a sharp, definitive click in the silent room. "You're also correct that I filed a harassment complaint against you," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as the table. "I filed it a year ago, when I first discovered your phantom consulting firm, and yesterday morning, in this very room. You used that old complaint as leverage to force me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, one specifically designed to prevent me from speaking about your familial relationships at work. You did so under the false pretense of my having filed a new complaint." I looked at Celeste, my eyes boring into hers. "This pen recorded the entire meeting, your threats, your lies, your admission that you believe I have no proof. It's all there." I saw the shift in Arthur Vance out of the corner of my eye. He had been leaning back slightly, in a defensive posture, ready to protect his CFO. Now, he slowly, deliberately, leaned forward. He picked up his own pen, clicked it open, and began to write on his notepad. He had ceased to be her lawyer. He was now simply the company's lawyer, documenting a catastrophic liability. The silence was finally broken by the voice from the speakers, Inez Wolfe. She spoke 3 short, sharp commands. "This session is paused. Arthur, secure all data pertaining to these allegations. Get our digital forensics team on the line, now." The connection went dead. The screen behind Celeste went black, plunging the head of the table into shadow. For the first time, she turned her head and looked at me fully. The mask of the martyr was gone. The condescension was gone. The arrogance was gone. Her face was a blank slate, and her eyes were filled with a terrifying, cold clarity. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition. She wasn't looking at her stepdaughter anymore. She wasn't looking at a subordinate employee she could crush. She was looking at an equal. She was looking at the person holding the hammer. and she was finally seeing the nail. The 2-hour pause felt like a lifetime compressed into a single, held breath. I remained in the boardroom, a silent sentinel at my end of the table. Celeste was escorted to a separate glass-walled office, where she sat, perfectly poised, making calls, a general directing a losing battle from a remote command post. The digital forensics team, a pair of quiet, intense specialists who moved with the unnerving calm of bomb disposal experts, had taken my data and descended into the company's servers. They were following the map I had drawn for them, authenticating every breadcrumb, verifying every link in the chain. At 11:15 a.m., the board reconvened, the forensics lead, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see in code, stood at the head of the table. Celeste was brought back in, her expression a careful, curated mask of detached curiosity. She was no longer a participant. She was a specimen under a microscope. Our findings are conclusive. The forensics lead began, her voice devoid of emotion. Her presentation appeared on the main screen, not with graphs and charts, but with simple, stark flow diagrams. The Marrow Foundation, a registered 501c3 charity, has made regular substantial payments for educational services to a vendor. That vendor is Ash Bristle Partners. The first connection was drawn, a clean black line connecting Celeste's public virtue to her private vehicle for fraud. From Ash Bristle Partners, the lead continued, clicking to the next slide. The funds were not dispersed to any educational providers. Instead, they were funneled through a series of 3 additional shell corporations, each registered in a different offshore tax haven. More lines appeared on the screen, a spiderweb of transactions designed to muddy the trail. After being washed through these entities, the money was then deposited, in smaller, irregular increments, into a single destination account. A final box appeared on the screen, a black hole at the center of the web. The account is a private investment portfolio at a Blackwater brokerage firm. The sole beneficiary of that portfolio is Celeste Blythe Marrow. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. It was no longer about falsified expense reports or petty corporate theft. This was a multi-year, multi-layered money laundering scheme, using a charity for abused women as the washing machine. Celeste had used the very people she claimed to be championing as a shield for her greed. Furthermore, the forensics lead added, we analyzed internal communications regarding the 1.73% variance Ms. Vale identified. An email appeared on the screen, a smoking gun in plain text. It was from Celeste to her executive assistant. Dated 8 months prior, it read, TNE model. The 1.73% deviation is still too high. We need to get it closer to the statistical noise floor. Make the necessary adjustments to reduce the model's sensitivity in this area. We can't have our own systems flagging our efficiencies. She had named her crime efficiency. She had described her theft as statistical noise. The email was a confession of intent, a direct order to manipulate the very auditing systems I managed, to blind the watchdogs she knew were there. Arthur Vance, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. His voice was strained, the voice of a man watching his company's stock price plummet in his mind's eye. He looked at me, not Celeste. Ms. Vale, this is extensive, but the board needs to understand the link. What is the direct, tangible evidence connecting Ms. Marrow's personal conduct, the allegations in your recording, to these corporate malfeasances? It was the question I had been waiting for, the final bridge between her two worlds. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid a single, silver-framed photograph to the center of the table. It was from the society pages of a local magazine, taken at the Marrow Foundation's annual fundraising gala 2 months ago. In the photo, Celeste stood at a podium, smiling benevolently, her hand raised in a gesture of welcome. On her wrist was a stunning, one-of-a-kind diamond and sapphire bracelet. That bracelet, I said softly, is a beautiful piece. It was purchased by Celeste from a custom jeweler in New York. I slid a second document next to the photo, It was an invoice from the jeweler for $27,000, and next to it, a third document, the corresponding Candle Row expense report. The charge was categorized under donor and investor gifting. It had been approved by Celeste herself. She was literally wearing the evidence of her crimes. Before anyone could speak, Inez Wolf's voice cut through the speakers, sharp and clear. "Mr. Vale is on the line. I want the board to hear him." A new voice filled the room, hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each word. It was my father. He was in a conference room with our lawyers, 2 floors below. He confirmed the timeline of Celeste's abuse. He described the sounds of breaking glass and slammed doors that I had captured on the smartwatch. And he confirmed, his voice shaking with a mixture of shame and anger, that he had never, not once, used the corporate Uber account. He stated that Celeste controlled all the corporate cards in his name, that he was, for all intents and purposes, a financial prisoner in his own home. Celeste, who had been watching the proceedings with a detached, analytical coldness, finally broke. Her defense, when it came, was not a denial. It was a vicious, targeted assault on her accusers. "This is a farce," she spat, her voice a blade. "My husband is a drunk. He's unstable, prone to fits of rage and fantasy. He bruises himself in his drunken stupors and blames me." She turned her venomous gaze on me. "And she said, her voice dripping with manufactured pity, "is a deeply troubled young woman. She has always resented my presence in her father's life. This is a pathetic, coordinated attempt at character assassination by 2 mentally unstable people." It was her final, desperate gambit, to turn the courtroom into a psychiatric ward, and us into delusional patients, but I had anticipated it. "Speaking of unstable behavior and character assassination," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through hers, "I'd like to draw the board's attention to a series of anonymous text messages I received over the past 6 months. The messages appeared on the screen, ugly and threatening. Leave Blackwater if you know what's good for you. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. We know where you live." "Standard corporate intimidation," Celeste scoffed. "It could have come from anyone." "It could have," I agreed. "But the metadata from the burner phone that sent these messages shows that it was purchased with a prepaid credit card, a card that was used only one other time, to pay for the renewal of the web hosting for the Marrow Foundation's website. The purchase was made by your executive assistant." That was the final blow. The last layer of the label ripped away. Celeste had not just committed fraud and abuse. She had orchestrated a campaign of terror against me, using her assistant as a proxy. Inez Wolf's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Celeste, we're asking you to leave the room while the board deliberates." Celeste stood slowly, her composure a shattered ruin. She gathered her purse, her movements stiff, robotic. As she walked past my chair, she leaned down, her face just inches from mine, her burnt cinnamon perfume thick and suffocating. "You will regret this for the rest of your life," she whispered, her voice a low, venomous promise. I didn't look at her. I looked straight ahead at the blank screen where her empire had just been dismantled. "I've regretted the last 3 years," I replied, my voice so quiet only she and I could hear it. "Last night was the last time." She straightened up and walked to the door without another word. The heavy oak door swung shut behind her, its final, soft click echoing in the vast, silent room. For a long moment, I stared at the door's polished surface. In it, I could see a distorted, wavering reflection of my own face. It wasn't shaking. While the board deliberated, a single, loose thread remained. It wasn't enough to prove Celeste was a thief and an abuser. I had to prove she was a fraud in her very soul, that her entire corporate persona was a hollow shell. I turned to the one remaining camera in the boardroom, the one connected to Inez Wolf. "Chairwoman," I said, my voice low and even, "there's one more thing you need to see. It's on the 9th floor." The 9th floor was a ghost wing. After a corporate restructuring, it had been left mostly vacant, a quiet, climate-controlled space waiting for a purpose, but it was home to one thing: the physical servers for Celeste's magnum opus. Project Lantern, to the public, to the media. Project Lantern was Celeste's legacy. It was a groundbreaking philanthropic initiative to create a secure data-sharing network for rural medical clinics. She had been on the cover of Blackwater Business Monthly, standing in front of the server racks, lauded as a visionary, a corporate citizen using Candle Row's resources to save lives. It was her armor of public virtue, and I was about to show Inez Wolf that it was made of smoke. Wolf met me at the elevator, her expression grim, her movements decisive. We rode down in silence, the soft hum of the elevator a stark contrast to the storm raging in the boardroom above. The 9th floor was eerily quiet. Our footsteps echoed on the polished concrete floors. We walked to a locked, glass-walled room at the end of the hall. The sign on the door read, Project Lantern, Data Hub. I swiped my access card, and the lock clicked open. Inside, rows of server racks hummed, their blue and green lights blinking in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The room was cold, the air filtered and sterile. It looked, for all the world, like the nerve center of a vital operation. On paper, I explained, this project has consumed over $4 million in software licensing, consulting fees, and hardware costs over the past 2 years. I sat at the administrator's terminal and logged in. The project's file directory appeared on the screen, a neat, orderly system of folders. I looked at Wolf. This is the project Celeste showcased to the press. I clicked on the first folder, Patient Data Protocols. It opened to reveal a dozen subfolders. I clicked on one. It was empty. I went back and clicked on another. Empty. I moved to the next main folder, Network Security Architecture. It contained a list of impressive-sounding documents. I clicked on Encryption Keys, TXT. The file opened. It contained a single word, pending. Every file was a placeholder. Every folder was a facade. It was a digital Potemkin village, a multi-million-dollar empty set. We went through the entire directory, folder by folder. It was a slow, methodical autopsy of a lie. With each click, the scale of her deception became more profound. She hadn't just inflated costs. She had invented a project whole cloth, an elaborate fiction designed to generate fraudulent expenses and burnish her public image. Finally, we reached the last file, in the deepest, most obscure subdirectory. The file was named Final Directive, Text. I opened it. The screen was blank, save for a single, blinking cursor. And next to it, one word. Shh. It wasn't typed. It was a scanned image of a handwritten note. In Celeste's sharp, elegant script, it was a joke, a private, arrogant taunt from a criminal so confident she could never be caught that she left a signature on her crime. A final little flourish of contempt for anyone who might come looking. Inez Wolf stared at the screen for a long, silent moment. She wasn't shocked. She was a former prosecutor, and I could see the cold, hard calculus in her eyes. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance anymore. This was wire fraud on a massive scale. She finally turned to me, her voice low. What is our narrative for the media, Ms. Vale? How do we spin this? We don't, I replied, closing the laptop. We don't need a PR firm. We need the district attorney's office. As the elevator doors closed, sealing us in for the ride back up to the 30th floor, my phone vibrated. It was a text message from the head of building security, a man I had cultivated a professional relationship with over the years. The message was short, a single, explosive sentence. Celeste Marrow is currently in her office attempting a bulk data download from the executive server to a personal USB drive. She was trying to burn the evidence, or so I thought. I showed the phone to Wolf. Her eyes narrowed. She took out her own phone and typed a rapid 2-word message, presumably to Arthur Vance. "Lock her out," she commanded the air. "Now." We stepped out of the elevator into a silent, tense lobby on the executive floor. Arthur Vance was waiting for us. "A system-wide preservation order has been issued," he said, his face pale. "Her network access has been terminated. Security is on its way to her office to retrieve all personal devices. Celeste was a step ahead. The call came 2 minutes later. She wasn't in her office. She was in the main lobby, heading for the doors. She had been tipped off, likely by her assistant, the moment her access was cut. She was making a run for it. We intercepted her by the main security turnstiles. 2 corporate security guards flanked her, their expressions apologetic but firm. She looked at us, her face a mask of cold fury. She wasn't panicked. She was indignant, outraged that these peons would dare to impede her exit. She clutched a small silver USB drive in her hand. "This is my personal property," she snarled. "You have no right." "Celeste," Vance said, his voice weary. "Company policy dictates that all devices used on the company network are subject to search. Please, hand over the drive." She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Or what? You'll fire me? Go ahead. This drive is my severance package." She thought it was her leverage, her copy of the Phantom Project Lantern files that she could use to blackmail the company. But Inez Wolf simply nodded to the security chief. He stepped forward, and Celeste, seeing the absolute, unyielding resolve in his eyes, finally seemed to understand. Her fight collapsed. With a gesture of utter contempt, she dropped the USB drive into his outstretched, gloved hand. We returned to the boardroom, the silver drive placed in the center of the table like a piece of unexploded ordnance. The forensics lead took it and plugged it into her secure laptop. We all watched the screen, expecting to see the empty folders and hollow files of Project Lantern. We were all wrong. The drive didn't contain a single file related to the project. It contained a single, meticulously organized folder. The folder was titled Rowan Vale, Containment Strategy. Inside were dozens of documents. There were drafted versions of the harassment complaint, each more detailed and vicious than the last. There were audio files, snippets of my voice from recorded meetings, cleverly edited to make me sound unstable. There were my performance reviews, annotated with fabricated concerns about my emotional state. There was a detailed, step-by-step plan for how to leak information to corporate blogs to discredit me before firing me. It was the complete architectural blueprint of her conspiracy against me. In her haste to secure a weapon to use against the company, she had grabbed the wrong one. She had grabbed the evidence of her own premeditated, malicious campaign to destroy an employee. She was so insulated by her own arrogance, so certain of her victory, that she had saved a pristine copy of her own criminal conspiracy. The final, fatal blow against Celeste Marrow wasn't delivered by me, or by the board, or by the data. It was delivered, with breathtaking precision, by her own hand. The board filed back into the room not with the heated energy of a debate, but with the cold, quiet finality of a firing squad assembling. They took their seats, their movements economical, their faces unreadable stone. The performance was over. This was the execution. Celeste was brought in last, her posture ramrod straight, a queen being led to a scaffold she refused to acknowledge. Arthur Vance stood, the thick binder containing the summary of her entire life's deceit in his hand. He didn't look at Celeste. He addressed the room, his voice a dry, dispassionate instrument of corporate justice. He read from a single sheet of paper, his words precise, measured, and utterly devastating. Each charge was a nail hammered into her coffin. Following a review of the evidence presented and the findings of the independent digital forensics investigation, the preliminary conclusion is as follows, he began, the legal formality a thin veil over the brutality of the words. A pattern of gross misconduct has been established, consisting of, but not limited to, first, systematic abuse of executive authority for personal enrichment. Staple. Second, embezzlement of corporate funds exceeding $7 million, conducted through a network of shell corporations and the fraudulent use of a charitable foundation. Staple. Third, a coordinated campaign of retaliation and intimidation against a subordinate employee, constituting a severe breach of our corporate code of conduct and creating a hostile work environment. Staple. And fourth, Vance paused, his gaze finally, briefly, flicking toward Celeste. Credible evidence supporting allegations of a pattern of economic and domestic abuse, leveraging corporate assets and accounts, which has exposed this company to significant reputational and legal risk. Staple. The final charge landed, and the room was utterly silent. Celeste stood in the center of that silence, a statue of defiance. She did not look ashamed. She did not look afraid. She looked, for all the world, like she was the one who had been wronged. She slowly scanned the faces of the board members, the men and women she had charmed, bullied, and enriched for years. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," she said, her voice not loud, but low and vibrating with contained fury. "I built the financial bedrock of this company. I steered us through 2 recessions. My contacts, my strategies, they are woven into the very fabric of Candle Row. If you remove me, this company will not just falter, it will collapse. You will all be ruined." It was her last, most potent weapon. Fear, the threat of mutual assured destruction. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in the eyes of one of the older board members, a man whose entire net worth was tied up in company stock. But before the fear could take root, Inez Wolf's voice sliced through the tension, coming crisp and cold from the speakers. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were absolute. "Candle Row survived for 50 years before anyone here had ever heard your name. Celeste," the voice said, "a statement of fact, not an opinion. We will survive long after everyone has forgotten it." The rebuttal was so swift, so complete, it sucked the very air from Celeste's threat, leaving it a hollow, pathetic husk. Her last weapon had been disarmed. She had nothing left. Inez Wolf continued, her voice now a rapid-fire series of commands directed at Vance. "Arthur, the board's decision is unanimous. You are to execute the following, effective immediately. Celeste Marrow's employment with Candle Row Insights is terminated, for cause. 2. A copy of our complete investigative file, including all forensic data, is to be delivered by courier to the office of the District Attorney of Blackwater County before the end of the day. 3. You are to file an immediate injunction to freeze all personal and corporate assets linked to Ms. Marrow, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. That includes the investment portfolio, all bank accounts, and the Marrow Foundation." Each directive was a final, percussive slam of a gavel. Celeste swayed slightly, the first visible crack in her marble facade. It was happening too fast. The efficient, ruthless machinery she had once commanded was now being turned against her with terrifying speed. While Vance began making calls on his private line, I stood and walked to the small, adjacent conference room where my father was waiting with the lawyers. He looked up as I entered, his face a roadmap of fear and hope. I placed a document in front of him. It was an emergency protective order against Celeste, drafted by the company's legal team. Next to it was a retainer agreement. "The company is paying for it all." "Dad," I said softly, "they'll represent you through the divorce, the criminal case, everything. You just have to sign." His hand, which had trembled so violently just 2 nights ago, was steady as he took the pen. He signed his name, the loops and lines of his signature a declaration of his own quiet, long overdue independence. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. But he wasn't sad. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated relief. When I returned to the boardroom, she was still there, standing in a strange, silent limbo while security guards waited discreetly by the door. The board members were already gone, vanishing back to their own offices to manage the fallout. It was just me, her, and the ghosts of her crimes in the silent, empty room. She turned and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. The rage was gone, the arrogance, the pity, the contempt. All of it had been burned away. All that was left was a profound, terrifying emptiness. Her eyes were vacant, her face a blank mask. She looked like Project Lantern, a hollow, expensive, and ultimately meaningless shell. Two security guards, a man and a woman, stepped forward. "Ms. Marrow," the woman said, her voice gentle but firm. "We've been asked to escort you from the building." She didn't resist. She didn't say another word to me. She simply turned and walked out of the boardroom, flanked by her polite, silent captors. I followed at a distance, a silent observer of her final moments. The walk through the executive lobby was quiet. Most people were at lunch, and those who saw her looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their phones. There was no grand scene, no shouting, just the quiet, humiliating process of being erased. When she reached the main lobby, she walked toward the massive brass revolving doors. She pushed through, and I watched her step out onto the rain-slicked pavement of the city. The door spun slowly behind her, its heavy glass and metal panels moving with a final, inexorable whoosh. It was the sound of a vault being sealed, the sound of a full stop at the end of a long, destructive sentence. I turned around and went back to my desk. I ignored the concerned glances of my team. I typed a short, formal email to Human Resources and my direct supervisor, requesting an immediate 30-day leave of absence to assist with the pending investigation and to attend to a family matter. I hit send. A moment later, a company-wide email landed in my inbox. The subject was, "A message regarding our commitment to a safe and transparent workplace." I read the first line, a perfectly crafted piece of corporate doublespeak about integrity and accountability, and then I closed the message. I right-clicked on my email client and selected Turn off notifications. I didn't need their praise. I didn't need their apologies. The war was over. The numbers had been balanced. The anomaly had been purged from the system. I leaned back in my chair, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I didn't need justice anymore. I just needed to sleep. The next morning, the silence in my father's kitchen was a foreign country. For 3 years. Silence in this house had been a weapon, a tense, breathless vacuum that followed a storm. It was the sound of held breath, of footsteps on eggshells. But this silence was different. It was soft, porous, and filled with the gentle, mundane sounds of a new day. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant call of a bird outside the window. It was a silence that healed rather than suffocated. My father stood at the counter, his back to me, engaged in the simple, profound ritual of making coffee. I watched his hands, the hands of a man who worked with electricity, who understood the flow of power. For the first time in years, they were perfectly still. There was no tremor, no slight, nervous shake as he spooned the dark grounds into the filter. His movements were deliberate, calm, reclaimed. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the small space, a scent so normal, so fundamentally domestic, it felt like a miracle. He poured the steaming black liquid into 2 mugs, the ones my mother had bought 20 years ago, chipped and faded, but familiar. He turned and placed one of the mugs on the small wooden table in front of me. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood there, looking at me, his eyes clear of the fog of fear I had grown so accustomed to seeing. The faint yellow bruise beneath his eye was the only remaining artifact of the old world, a fading ghost on the horizon of the new one. "I'm sorry, Rowan," he said, his voice quiet but solid, stripped of the broken, whispering quality it had held at the party. It was the voice I remembered from my childhood. "I'm so sorry I told you not to tell anyone." The apology was for so much more than just those words. It was an apology for the years of silence, for the fear that had paralyzed him, for the burden he had allowed me to see but asked me not to carry. It was the sound of a man finding his voice again. I looked down into the black coffee, its surface a dark, still mirror. "I did tell, Dad," I replied, my voice just as quiet. "I just told the right people. I told the server logs. I told the security cameras. I told the data streams and the spreadsheets. I told the truth to the only witnesses I knew would be impartial, incorruptible, and have perfect recall." My gaze fell upon my wrist, to the sleek black watch that had been a constant presence for a year. It felt heavy now, Its purpose served. Slowly, I unclasped the silver band. The cool metal slid from my skin, leaving a pale, blank space behind. I held it in my palm for a moment. It wasn't a poisoned gift anymore. It wasn't a leash or a symbol of her control. It had been a tool, a silent, steadfast witness that had recorded the truth when no one else would listen. It had done its job. I placed it on the table next to my house keys. A piece of technology demoted back to a simple object, its secret life now concluded. As if on cue, my phone, which had been silent all morning, vibrated on the table, a single email notification. The sender was Inez Wolf. The subject line was blank. I opened it. The message was only 4 words, a simple declarative statement that carried the weight of the entire Candle Row institution behind it. "We stand with you." A small, involuntary smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or of joy. It was a smile of acknowledgement, a quiet, internal confirmation that the system, the cold, impartial corporate machinery I had placed my faith in, had held. I had presented my case, and the verdict had been rendered. The line of code had executed correctly. The equation had been balanced. I stood up and walked to the sliding glass door that led to the small back patio. The morning was bright, the sky a clean, cloudless blue. I slid the door open, and the blackwater sunlight poured into the kitchen, sharp and clear, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners. It felt like opening a brand new, perfectly formatted spreadsheet. The cells empty and clean, waiting for new data, a new story. There would be no public spectacle, no explosive tell-all interview, no viral social media campaign. The business news would report, in their dry, passive language, that Celeste Marrow had resigned to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately. Her name would be a headline for a day, a footnote the next, and then she would be gone, erased from the corporate ledger. Her downfall wasn't a loud, theatrical explosion. It was a quiet, methodical deletion of a corrupted file. The justice was in the reversal. The source of her power had become the instrument of her undoing. The workplace, the gleaming steel and glass tower she had used as a fortress to hide her private brutality, had become the very stage where that brutality was exposed and judged. She had leveraged her corporate power to inflict personal pain, and in the end, I had leveraged that same corporate power to deliver personal justice. It was a perfect, symmetrical, and deeply private victory. I took out my phone again and sent a short text to my team lead. "Taking the day off. See you tomorrow." I didn't need to give a reason. The company-wide email had been reason enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt the simple, uncomplicated desire for a day of quiet, a day with no data to analyze, no patterns to find. I slid the glass door shut. The latch clicked into place, a soft, definitive sound. The story was over. The case was closed. The file was archived. Thank you all so much for listening to our story today. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So drop a comment down below and let's connect. What did you think of Rowan's Revenge? Share your thoughts with us. And if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It also helps us out a ton if you hit that hype button to help more people discover this story.